So our next speaker is Brendan Cummings, who happens to be a fellow alumnus of the University of Lethbridge. So big shout out for the U of A or U of L. Sorry. Oh, well, there's a big, I'm going to get kicked off the Zoom for that one. Okay. Brendan is an instructor at the School of Liberal Education. His research focuses on the intersection of the history of religion, new religious movements, and the constructs of cultural and personal identity. Teaching was never something Brendan planned to do, but not having a clear path was not unusual for someone who has worked as a bartender, a bouncer, a sawmill worker, a chef, kitchen manager, radio DJ, construction and slaughterhouse worker, and an iron worker over the course of his life. That's a long resume. In all of his classes, students are encouraged to stretch the boundaries of how they acquire knowledge and how they think about the world in which they live and work. His academic journey has many starts and stops, and he's been to university, college, and technical school. His interests are broad and varied, ranging from classic opera to race and religion to comic book culture. He believes his experience shows that a liberal education does not start and finish in the classroom. It extends to the world beyond these walls. Brendan's last lecture for you is titled, Here and Back Again, The Beauty of the Unknown and Not Knowing What I Want to Be When I Grow Up. So Brendan, go ahead. The virtual stage is all yours.
Thank you. I do actually have a slide deck because some of this stuff is really hard to explain without it. So I'm assuming that everybody can see that. Give me a thumbs up if you can.
I can see it. So I think, yeah,
delightful. So I'm never entirely sure that I have anything to say when I'm asked to do these sorts of things. But I suspect that my name came up not necessarily because of my academic brilliance or my teaching or my sparkling wit and charming personality, but because of my what best could be described as unconventional path to academia. In the bio you just heard, there was a list of some of the things I've done in the past 30 plus years, and there's a few more kicking around in there, including vacuum cleaner salesman at one point. Today I want to talk to you about the winding path there and back, and some of the things that I learned along the way. I started in 1989 at the University of Lethbridge, so a while ago. I was 17, but I'd been 17 for only about 3 months. I actually spent most of my high school year as a 16-year-old. And I like to tell people that I had a lot of fun when I came to the U of L, but the first semester was a disaster. There was no one to tell me what to do, where to go, or how to spend my time. And I had no idea what I was doing. At the end of the first semester, I got a letter telling me I was on academic probation. And I had no idea what that meant, and I didn't bother to try and find out either. I was smart, I get it figured out. Fair warning, this picture has a vulgar image on it because it'll show you how classy I was. Just hang on here and make sure what's happening here. Hold on, folks, just give me 1 second. Suddenly it opened up a whole bunch of windows that I didn't want to open up. There you go. It was actually about 1991, but you can see what a cool dude I was back then. At the end of the first semester, though, too, I was also introduced to some people who would change my life and my world. One of them is actually in this picture with me. He was the editor of the Meliorist for a number of years. It was in the spring of 1990 that I became a news writer for the Meliorist and also started doing a radio show at CKUL, which was the old campus radio station. This is actually one of my first bylines, the housing story in the bottom corner there from January 25th, 1990. I was introduced to people that who seemed to laugh and live with more energy than anything I'd ever seen. They were passionate, they were brilliant, and I was hooked. The Meliorist published every week, which meant we had to come up with a lot of content to get into the paper every week. So we researched stories, went to meetings, interviewed deans and profs. The story down the bottom right corner, students gearing up for major protest. We did, actually. We marched down 3rd Avenue, stopping traffic and waving signs to protest tuition hikes. John Gogo was the Minister for Advanced Education and the MLA for Lethbridge. When a dean suddenly left his position here at the University of Lethbridge, we poked and prodded, made some inquiries, and some possibly libelous insinuations about his sudden departure, which got the attention of the president of the university, who didn't like the student newspaper anyway. That led to some other nastiness that I'm not going to get too far into. But ultimately, we believed that we were uncompromising and fighting for a better world. During all of this, I was having the time of my life, but I was also not going to class. And by the end of the semester, I received a required to withdraw letter inviting me to never come back. So I was kicked out of the University of Lethbridge after 1 year, and I had no idea what I was going to do next. I spent a few years away from Lethbridge, and in that time, I worked at a sawmill, as I mentioned, in Cochrane, Alberta. I went to England to see my mother's family. My mother's family is all in Derby, in the dead center of England, weirdly enough. Did some work as a bartender there, bummed around, spent all my money, came back. I still didn't really know what I wanted to be, but since I was a smart guy, I decided to take another crack at post-secondary. I went to Red Deer College, was relatively focused in the first 2 months, and then it all went to hell. Weirdly, a student newspaper was involved there as well. This did not end well for my post-secondary career, and I was pretty convinced that school was for suckers. So I came back to Lethbridge to try and figure out what I wanted to be. I didn't even try university. I just looked for a job. A job as a food runner at the old Billy McIntyre's cattle company, which is where Moxie's is now, actually, opened a door that I would keep going through for most of my adult life. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. Also in this time, I got married and moved from Lethbridge to Camrose. And while I connected with cooking, two things were clear, at least in the early 90s, before the rise of the celebrity chef. Cooking wasn't necessarily a career. And now I needed to really start thinking about what I wanted to be when I grew up. I landed a job working construction. I was making good money. I even applied to be apprentice as a welder, and it was a real job. I was growing up. Then I got laid off. So I went back to cooking, mostly because I could, and it was the only job I could get. And it was becoming clear that while school might be for suckers, I didn't have a lot of training or skill in anything but working in these kitchens. And it wasn't a career yet. And I went to one of those career sort of workshops that the government's put on every now and again. And they asked me, if you could do anything, what would you do? And for some reason, I thought of the fun I had working at the campus radio station at the University of Lethbridge. So I randomly decided to become a radio DJ. I was accepted at NAIT, and I started to train to be a broadcaster. The program at NAIT is 2 years. It's really intense. I was lucky enough to land a job in the summer between first and second year with 100.3 The Bear, which was a rock station in Edmonton. None of us used our real names. You actually had to sit with the talent, and they came up with a name for you. I became Bulldog, hence the picture with the bulldog. I also did my practicum. I did some work at a 3-station sort of center in Saskatoon, and I had a blast. We did all of the wild and crazy stuff. Standing in the pouring rain, having somebody pour water all over themselves for, I think they were Offspring tickets. When U2 came to Edmonton, I asked for a bullet to go with my Blue Sky. Bring me a bullet to go to the Blue Sky, you'll get the tickets. Only to have somebody screech up in a truck, remove the rifle from their rifle rack in the back window, pull a chamber out, a round out of the chamber and hand it to me. That was interesting. I showed up for work in Saskatoon to have somebody handcuffed to the front door so they could get tickets to the Backstreet Boys. I saw U2, Metallica, Kiss on the Kiss and Make Up tour when the original lineup reunited, the Rolling Stones, Foo Fighters, Green Day, the Tragically Hip. I stood in front of thousands of people to introduce bands at another roadside attraction. I drank beer with the Headstones and the Jeff Healey Band, and I know that many of you probably might not know who they are, but they were a big deal to me. I also got to interview and drink a glass of scotch with Diana Krall in Saskatoon. It was the time of my life. But it wasn't a grown-up job. And it became fairly apparent that for me to turn this into a grown-up job or a career, I wasn't going to be able to stick around home. I was going to have to go farther afield. And I needed to be close to home because my wife and I were starting a family. And I needed to figure out something else that I wanted to be. Now, I'd been cooking all the time while I was in radio school and even while I was working in radio, because radio doesn't pay very much, to pay some bills. And I made some connections. One of those connections offered me a job at the Sidetrack Cafe, which was one of the premier live music venues in Western Canada. The pay was good, and I had a relatively regular schedule, even though it was all nights. And shortly after I started at Sidetrack, this beautiful young lady came along, my daughter Sky. And shortly after she was born, my wife and I got divorced. Fatherhood meant being a grown-up, meant being a model citizen and seeing my daughter. Now I really needed to know what I was doing with my life. The Sidetrack was open from 7 a.m. till 3 a.m. And some days I was there for that entire time. Sometimes because we were busy, sometimes just because I was hanging around, I wanted to see the band, and this was a new family. It was a full service restaurant as well as a bar. So we had a full dinner menu as well as a bar menu. We would make dinner for 300 people and then feed them bar food all night while Spirit of the West tore the house down. I had Jim Cuddy hanging around in the kitchen because he was just a nice guy and wanted to meet the cooks who made his food. I saw Tegan and Sarah do the open stage on a Monday night. And when the calendar clicked over to the year 2000, I had Corb Lund playing without the Smalls, but the Hurtin' Albertans did a pretty good job playing some small songs. It was also my first management job, my first time building and training a team. And I discovered that I was very good at it. It was almost like a grown-up job. I applied to apprentice as a chef. And I spent the next 5 or 6 years cooking, everything from fine dining to family diners, in an industry that connected everybody who worked in it to a diverse and very colorful culture through a shared experience. Cooking was my career, and all was well. Then I met someone who lived here. She actually worked for the U of L at the time. And we talked about ways that I might be able to restart my degree, maybe. I wasn't so sure that that was what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't necessarily want to cook in Edmonton anymore. Really, I didn't know what I wanted to do at all anymore. So I packed everything I owned into a 6-foot trailer, moved back to Lethbridge. And I tried some career type jobs. I tried cooking again. Passion just wasn't the same. Worked at a slaughterhouse, Maple Leaf Foods here in town. Just wasn't my jam. And a friend asked me if I'd be interested in working in a foundry. And I really had no idea what that meant, but it was regular work, regular shift, pay was good. So leaping again into the unknown, I went to work at Lethbridge Ironworks. I was a furnaceman. I was one of the people who made the metal. This is actually the area that I worked in. Picture a big pot in the floor, like a big kettle holding about 45,000 pounds of molten iron. And it's powered by a big water-cooled battery strapped to the bottom. Now imagine somebody draining this kettle on a regular basis. And the furnaceman's job was to keep that kettle full, hot, around 2800 degrees, and chemically correct. In some ways, it was an amazing job. It stretched me mentally and physically. It pushed the limits of what I thought I could do. It was hard, hot, as you can imagine, and dangerous work. And I was making money. And we started to do some of the things that grown-ups do. We bought a house, did some renos, bought another house. I had some toys. I had a job that I could consider a career. I was grown up. So if I was grown up here, how did I get there? How did I get here? Well, it's because of all the things I just kind of talked about. In those first months of 1990, I met some of the people who were my nearest and dearest friends, even now. I learned and developed relationships based on ideas and argument. For the first time, I was exposed to what activism might look like and how to voice an opinion and be heard. And while the relationships I made in university and college were forged in ideas, the relationships I built in the commercial kitchens of Alberta were built on a shared culture. It takes a certain kind of mindset to do it and do it well. And there is a savage beauty in a fully functioning commercial kitchen that only those who've worked in one can understand. And so from that, cooking taught me what a team looks like, how to build it and nurture it, how to build relationships in that environment. It taught me to lead by example, that you can't ask people to do things you aren't willing to do. It taught me how to teach and to train, to give direction and be supportive as the people you work with learn how to do something. My deep, long-lasting connection to surrounding myself with a diverse community came from working in kitchens. I learned about being an ally, about standing up for those who are near and dear to me. The diversity of people from around the world and around the block working in the hospitality industry taught me to be open-minded, to embrace difference and celebrate diversity in all its forms. I learned how to try new things. Radio taught me the power of language, the way how we say things impacts the way people react and listen. And at the Ironworks, I learned that very often I was not the smartest person in the room, not because I didn't have the education, but because I didn't have the perspective or experience. I learned that education can be and often is contextual and situational. The problems we dealt with every day required creative solutions, often in minutes. We had to make decisions based on experience and calculated risk, even if we had no idea how things were going to turn out. It was here that I embraced the idea of trying things that have a high probability of success, but no guarantee. You had to trust in what you learned and what you knew, and even then it might not be enough. That was the risk you took. I started to take some of the things I'd learned through this unexpected journey and apply them to the journey I'd started so long ago. I retook 2 of the courses I failed, and instead of sliding through, I did what I'd learned in all my jobs. I did the work. I applied what I knew, and I did pretty well. So I came back and chipped away at my undergraduate degree, and colleagues who were much younger than me showed me again that I was not the smartest person in the room. I listened to these people, and they inspired me with their goals and their dreams. They offered me new perspectives and ushered me back into the community of ideas that had captivated me 30 years before. But I had a grown-up job, and I had no idea what I was going to do with a history degree. I just knew that I wanted it. At the urging of my wife, I went to grad school with no idea what that meant or what that was going to lead to. I knew that I didn't want to teach. If you'd have told me in my first year of graduate school that I'd be teaching in academia, I'd have told you were out of your mind. I did some work as a TA, but when I was approached to teach some labs in the School of Liberal Education, I was a bit reluctant. But because I didn't know what I wanted to do, I said, okay, and I loved it. And when I graduated in 2018 with an MA in history, I applied for a job teaching in the School of Liberal Education, not because it was suddenly what I wanted to be when I grew up, but because I loved it, at least right now. And it was new territory, something unknown. And I realized that teaching in this place is not just about sharing or pursuing what we know, it's about chasing and asking questions about what we don't. So as many of you have heard me say, and I got this from a history professor, so what? Who cares? Well, your education isn't limited to what you've done in the classroom. The late nights, the successes, the failures, the relationships built and broken, all of these are part of the education and is part of your liberal education. It's about challenging the way things have always been done through diverse worldviews and new ways of knowing. We talk about the pillars, breadth, connections, critical thinking, and civic engagement. I learned about all those things outside these walls, but I didn't really know what any of that meant until I was in these walls. For you, it goes the other way. Connect what you've learned inside to what's outside. And finally, I was asked once if I could tell my 17-year-old self about all the bumps in the road, whether I would give them the advice, and I said no. Most of what I am and what I do comes from not knowing what's around the next corner and not knowing what I want to be when I grow up. And if I knew then what I know now, I don't think I'd be in the same wonderful place. The unknown is what drives us. It inspires us. Taking unexpected paths is what makes the experience here and the journey out there so exciting and rewarding. And from someone who's been here, there, and back again, the adventure of the unknown, while terrifying at times, is very worth it. You can embrace the unknown because you're prepared for it as you leave this place. You'll know how to take the unexpected path, not just from what you learned in class, but what you've experienced outside of it. You'll use your liberal education to be better, to push boundaries and challenge the unknown and the establishment. And you never have to know exactly what you want to be when you grow up. And that's it.
Well, thanks very much there, Brendan. And I'm just going to note, I don't know if this ages myself or not, but I was at that protest in 1990 that you wrote about.
Were you?
Yeah, because I started at the U of L in 1989. And I very much remember it was a snowy day and we were walking down the street of 3rd Avenue and blocking traffic and all of that stuff. And so it was just a simple matter of, it was one of those, and it was the first time I've ever been to a protest and protested anything like that in my life. And
same here.
Yeah. So it was, when you mentioned that, I was like, oh boy.
Yeah, no, it does age us a little bit, but yeah, 89 was.
I still know my student ID number. So
do I. I have to use it still, actually. It's the same student ID number that I graduated with. So
yeah, well, I've always used to go to the University of Lethbridge gym before I came here. And so if I forgot my card, I had to say the number and they're like 89. I'm like, never mind, just let me in.
Just do the thing.
There we go. We have some questions here for you. What was the best or worst job that you ever had and why?
I have to say the sidetrack. I don't want to, I hope my boss isn't here. God, I should probably check. Hang on.
Do you want to check the participant list?
Yeah, no, she's not here. Okay. I love what I do right now, but the sidetrack was probably one of the best jobs I ever had because I met so many different people, so many different views and different, from a professional perspective, I had a lot of different types of food I had to cook. I learned what I was good at in the sidetrack. I learned how to build a team, which was just an invaluable skill that I can't even, yeah, I don't know where I'd be without it. And I saw some really cool music, and I had a really good time. It was the hospitality industry in Edmonton in the late 90s, early 2000s was very much an interconnected culture, and we all knew each other, and we ate at the same strange restaurants, and we all did sort of the same things. And it was really a wonderful time for me, even though, I just got divorced and I had a brand new baby and all the rest of that stuff, but it was a really good time. Worst job was the slaughterhouse. Maple Leaf Foods was the worst. It just all kinds of bad and wrong. And that tops the vacuum cleaner salesman. It was just, yeah, it was tough. So.
There we go. I'm going to go to a couple of questions that have come in on the Q&A. You talk about all these major life changes you experienced. Do you feel like you ever lost yourself in that process, or did your sense of self stay solid? And that comes from Carrie.
Wow. I don't think I ever really discovered a sense of self, if you will, really until I started working in science. Until I really kind of set out on my own. The first part of my life I spent doing the things, trying to be a grown-up, doing the things I was supposed to do to be grown up. When I stopped caring about being a grown-up, I figured out who I was and who I wanted to be and where I wanted to go. And I don't think that I think that I'm more in touch with it now. I don't think I've lost it. In fact, I think that I just keep pushing the boundaries of what I think I am. I'm never satisfied with this is it. Like, this is it. This is as good as I get. I just keep going, maybe there's something else. Maybe there's a new way to think of it. So.
Perfect. Well, I think too, it's just part of sort of that journey of moving forward, right? It's never truly done. We've got a question from Janie. In a time where it seems like the voices of the students and the youth are falling on the ears of the negligent and uncaring politicians, what do we do to enact change, especially in the era of social media?
Don't get worn out, because it's very easy to tire of talking. It's very easy to tire of the struggle and the push. Find allies. I think in the age of social media, we think that we're connected because we have social media, because I've got all these people that are following me, but they're not, in some ways, they're not real connections. You need to find people that you can work with in real time and in real space. Find those supports and those allies that can build you up, but also tell you when it's time to say, you know what, you're burning out, take a step, back off, take a minute. I also think y'all need to be, well, y'all saying, to young people, I guess, this is responding about young people. I don't see you marching in the street, at least not here. Other places, maybe, but get a sign, go for a walk, see what happens. Nothing might happen, but can't believe I'm inciting people to go out and march in the streets, but
What's interesting, I was fortunate enough to meet Candy Pultner. I always say her last name incorrectly. And she's giving a talk a little bit about this sort of same idea of, speaking up and advocating. And she said this thing that's just stuck with me ever since, is that you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be persistent. Yeah. And I always keep that in the back of my head because, advocacy work and trying to have your voice heard is really difficult to do. And like you said, it will tire you out and it will burn you out. And you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be persistent. And I always add a little bit of and consistent on top of that as well.
And I would like to say one more thing to that too.
You
just
bet.
as I'm talking about sort of marching in the street and things. Small incremental changes are still changes. You don't have to tear the entire system down today. It's the sort of erosion idea that it takes thousands of years to wear a hole in a rock. I don't want it to take thousands of years, but you still got to start somewhere. And so don't be discouraged if it's just a small change. A small change is better than nothing.
Yep. We have another question here from Kay Peterson. Amazing recount of your path to academia. Can you talk a bit more about the importance of liberal education and how it's even more relevant today?
Mm-hmm. I think it's more relevant today, and I do this in I do this in my classes. In my first year class, particularly, we spend a fair amount of time talking about practical applications of critical thinking and how to make these connections. I think that, again, with sort of the ease of access for information right now, the ability to get an answer to something in, you know, less than a second, means that we don't necessarily, and humans are lazy, we like the information that gets put in front of us. And so a liberal education, at least the way I understand it and the way I think about it, means to go outside of that narrow sort of parameter, that it forces you and demands that you don't just know one way to look at it. And I think that when you start to make those expansions and you start to make those connections, you start to ask really tough questions of the type of discourse that we're having right now. And when we start to force ourselves to look at other perspectives and force ourselves to broaden the way that we look at things, and sometimes it's very uncomfortable for us, it also means that we get more engaged, we make better decisions, and we come to a place where we can have a discussion or a discourse instead of just a polarized, you're a poopy head, no, you're a poopy head sort of discussion. I think that students who come here and embrace that idea of a liberal education are more capable and more willing to engage in hard conversations in positive fashion, to really enact the types of change that Janie was asking about. Those small sort of things, because you're asking good questions and you're willing to engage in it in a critical fashion. And that's what I think it's important. More important maybe now than ever.
Someone put in the chat that the kids are all right and they're getting out there even here, and they have a link to a climate rally that was organized in 2019 by some high school students. And then I'm going to confess to this person, Chelsea, is my neighbor in Lethbridge. So I'm going to send a shout out to Chelsea, who is also very active, you know, in the community as well. So hi, Chelsea.
The kids are absolutely all right. And it's probably a bit unfair to say I don't see you in the streets. And that's, you know, this is the memory of 30 years looking back going, oh, I was radical. I'm still radical, but I'm also not marching in the streets. So, you know, maybe that's on me as well.
Well, you know, we had a rally here in Edmonton, because I'm in Edmonton right now, pre-pandemic, where one of the locals here organized, you know, public service sort of matters, everything like public health, public education. Thinking maybe 1,000 people might show up. 13,000 people showed up for that rally here in Edmonton that day, and it was extraordinary. And I think that when the opportunities are there, and they'll come back post-pandemic, where we can gather more safely around those things, then I think we will see that come.
And I should say that I see in a lot of students, you know, this 18 to 25 generation, a desire to get involved. Just sometimes I think they need that direction, and perhaps this is, you know, get out there and get at her, which is good. I'm glad. I'm so glad.
I'm going to ask you the most, I don't know if you'll be able to, this is like the one with Dr. Stevens. Here's the hardest question when you have 2 minutes left.
Sure.
What's the biggest lesson from all your adventures?
You are not the smartest person in the room. Seriously. That's, to me, once I figured that out, and I figured it out before the ironworks, but once I figured it out, it opened up so many new ways of seeing things, so many new ways to do things and consider my teaching, my learning, my research, my students. Like I said this thing about, you know, the kids aren't out protesting, and immediately I've got somebody giving me an alternate to that. That proves I'm not the smartest person in the room. I'm okay with that. I think that in my position anyway, as a post-secondary instructor, I like them to know that I know lots about lots of stuff, but I am more than willing to learn. I need to learn just as much as you do. And I tell my students that. Students who've taken a class with me know at the end of my class, I always tell them, I learned as much from you as what you did from me, because I'm very rarely the smartest person in the room. So.
I personally bank on it.
Yeah.
Right. That I'm not the smartest person in the room, and that others will be there to help me. And I agree with all my years of teaching, you know, as much as I've taught students, students have taught me just as much back about themselves, about teenagers, about resiliency, and about myself as well. And so there we go. Well, thank you very much, Brendan, for your your presentation here today. I was going to ask you if it was Marvel or DC where you fell on either side of that fence, but that might be a debate for another day.
Batman. It's always Batman.
It's
That's
always
the only
Batman.
right answer.
Okay.
Everything else is wrong.
Always Batman. There we go.